April 2026, Western Pacific. A U.S. carrier strike group is moving at more than 30 knots with escorts spread across miles of ocean, electronic emissions controlled, air defenses layered, and over 60 aircraft available on the flight deck. On paper, this is the most heavily protected concentration of naval power on Earth, and yet the first real step in destroying it may happen hundreds of kilometers overhead, in silence, before a single missile leaves its launcher. That is the contradiction. The ship looks like the target, but the true center of gravity may be the network that keeps the target visible in the first place. That sounds backward, because carriers are supposed to be defeated by submarines, bombers, cruise missiles, or ballistic missiles. Steel against steel. Sea against sea. Most people imagine a naval kill chain beginning on the water. But in a Pacific fight, the hardest part is not launching the weapon. It is keeping custody of a moving ship long enough to make any weapon matter, and that is what makes this issue bigger than one ship. If a carrier can be tracked, updated, and targeted deep inside the Western Pacific, then every Allied base, sea lane, and reinforcement route near Taiwan comes under a different kind of pressure. The carrier is not just a warship. It is a mobile airfield, a logistics hub, a political signal, and a timing device for the entire campaign. If it has to stand farther back, the map changes. If it can move forward with confidence, the balance changes with it. So the serious question is not whether a missile can hit a carrier. Plenty of missiles can, in theory. The real question is whether an adversary can build and sustain the surveillance architecture required to find the right patch of ocean, identify the right formation, and pass target quality data through a chain that survives jamming, deception, maneuver, and time. Now widen the fray. Picture the battle space from the Chinese coast out through the first island chain, across the Philippine Sea, and toward Guam. This is not one smooth ocean, it is a layered detection problem. There are shore-based radars with limited geometry, over-the-horizon systems, that can cue but not perfectly resolve. Maritime patrol aircraft with endurance limits. Drones that can search but can also be hunted. Ships that can trail but risk being exposed. And satellites that can look down across huge distances but only in slices and intervals. China has spent years assembling exactly this kind of system of systems, using military and dual-use satellites, over-the-horizon radars, AEW aircraft, drones, maritime militia, Coast Guard vessels, and surface ships as overlapping sensors rather than isolated platforms. That matters because anti-ship missiles do not hunt on instinct. A D-51D can reach roughly 1,450 to 1,550 kilometers. A D-51-6 stretches to around 4,000 kilometers, and its anti-ship variant is meant to engage moving targets at sea. Those numbers sound decisive until you remember what they actually describe. They describe missile reach, not targeting certainty. Range is only useful after location becomes credible, current, and precise enough to survive the missile's flight time and the carrier's movement. But here's the problem. Carriers are not fixed airfields. A strike group moving at 30 knots covers more than 55 kilometers in an hour. Even in 30 minutes, it can displace roughly 28 kilometers. If the targeting picture is stale, the weapon may arrive at an empty ocean box. And that is before decoys, emission control, weather, false contacts, escort spacing, or route changes complicate the picture. This is why the obvious answer fails. The obvious answer says, just build more missiles. Saturate the defenses. Fire enough salvos and something gets through. But missile inventories do not solve a broken search problem. 1,000 arrows aimed at yesterday's coordinates are still wasted. More launchers do not erase revisit gaps. Bigger warheads do not fix classification errors. And longer range actually makes the surveillance burden worse because the search area expands while the target continues moving. The geometry becomes brutal very quickly. A carrier is a large ship, but the ocean is incomparably larger. If your search box is hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, the issue is not whether you possess a missile with a maneuvering re-entry vehicle. The issue is whether your sensors can compress that ocean into a valid firing solution before the ship exits the box. That is only half the equation. The other half is survivability. Every layer in the kill chain can be jammed, spoofed, delayed, or destroyed. A radar can be degraded. A drone can be intercepted, a relay node can be attacked, a transmission can be geolocated, a satellite can be dazzled, jammed, interfered with, or forced to compete with debris, weather, and orbital mechanics. The kill chain is not one weapon. It is a fragile argument connecting many different systems across land, sea, air, cyber, and space. And this is where orbit enters the story. Low Earth orbit is close enough to provide useful resolution, but that comes with a trade-off. Objects there move fast, very fast. Typical low Earth orbit sits roughly between 160 and 1600 kilometers in altitude, with orbital periods around 90 minutes to 2 hours. At roughly 400 kilometers, the International Space Station travels about 7.8 kilometers per second. That speed is why LEO can deliver sharp observation, but it is also why one satellite does not provide permanent stare over one moving naval target. It flashes overhead, collects, leaves, and hands the problem to something else. So if you want to maintain custody of a carrier, one satellite is not enough. One sensor family is not enough. You need a relay race. An orbital pass detects, another sensor refines, a radar cues, a drone investigates. Signals intelligence helps classify. Command nodes fuse. Then, only then, does a launcher receive a track it can trust. The ocean target is not destroyed by one platform. It is temporarily made legible by a chain of them. Now look at the bottleneck. If any part of that chain is thinned out at the wrong moment, the whole process begins to wobble. Not collapse forever. Just long enough. And in combat, long enough is everything. China's ISR design acknowledges this. Its surveillance architecture includes YAC and electro-optical, radar, and electronic intelligence satellites, geosynchronous imagery systems like Galfin 4, over-the-horizon radars, KJ-500 airborne early warning aircraft, long-endurance drones such as Soaring Dragon and Divine Eagle, plus trailing ships and even maritime militia as oceanic eyes and ears. This is not redundancy for convenience. It is redundancy because maritime targeting against the maneuvering carrier is inherently unstable, and the reverse is true for the United States. If a carrier strike group wants to survive inside missile range, defense does not start with the last interceptor in the magazine. It starts much earlier by forcing surveillance breaks. Break the detect phase. Break the classify phase. Break the classify phase. Break the relay between sensor and shooter. A missile battery that never receives target quality data is still dangerous, but it is no longer decisive. This is where the math changes. Suppose an anti-ship ballistic missile requires a reasonably current track before launch and terminal seeker support at the end. Even without using classified assumptions, the timeline is unforgiving. A distant sensor detects a carrier group. Data must be transmitted, fused, validated, and assigned. A launcher must receive orders, prepare, fire, and then trust that the target has not displaced too far by the time the warhead descends. If the combined delay from detection to terminal acquisition stretches toward an hour, the carrier may have shifted more than 50 kilometers from the original position. If uncertainty grows in every direction, the search area balloons. The terminal seeker is now trying to solve not a point problem but a region problem, while also fighting jamming and decoys. That is why orbital surveillance is so valuable. It shrinks uncertainty faster than slower. Lower, more vulnerable sensors can. A satellite does not need diplomatic access. It does not need a tanker. It does not worry about air defense corridors the same way an aircraft does. It can cue the next layer from above. But it is also why orbit becomes the first arena of the fight. The side that preserves its own overhead picture while blurring the enemy's wins a timing advantage that no missile brochure can capture. We already see how seriously this is taken. Open source assessments describe China's counterspace toolkit as a mix of direct descent anti-satellite weapons, co-orbital systems, jamming, laser dazzling, and cyber operations aimed at satellites, ground nodes, and the links between them. One Air University analysis frames a Taiwan scenario, in which the opening move is a coordinated effort to disrupt U.S. ISR, SATCOM, GPS, and related networks precisely to delay intervention and fracture joint force synchronization. That is not theater. That is an admission that modern maritime strike begins by attacking awareness. And once you see it that way, the carrier itself looks different. A carrier is not merely a ship trying to dodge missiles. It is one node inside a larger contest between scouting systems. Its escorts defend the hull. Its aircraft extend reach. Its electronic warfare suites distort sensing. Its emissions discipline reduces detectability. Its movement creates temporal uncertainty. Friendly submarines, aircraft, and space assets add their own pressure. In effect, the strike group is both a weapon and a moving problem set that the enemy must constantly solve under fire. This is why system integration matters more than any single heroic platform. The brain is the sensor fusion network. The shield is layered air and missile defense, electronic warfare, and deception. The hammer is the carrier air wing and the joint force it enables. Remove the brain and the hammer swings blind. Remove the shield and the brain becomes exposed. Remove the hammer and the system can survive but cannot change the campaign. Notice what follows from that. The contest is not simply between carrier and missile. It is between one reconnaissance strike complex and another. One side tries to maintain a continuous picture long enough to launch effective salvos. The other side tries to shatter that picture just long enough to keep maneuver space open. In that competition, even brief surveillance gaps have outsized value. And that creates the strategic consequence. If China can keep orbital and multi-domain custody of a U.S. carrier inside the first island chain, then U.S. naval aviation may be pushed farther east. Sortie timelines lengthen, tanker demands rise, and Allied confidence comes under strain. A carrier that must fight from farther away is still powerful but less immediate. On the other hand, if the United States and its allies can repeatedly blind, confuse, or thin the maritime surveillance web, then many of the most feared anti-ship weapons lose much of their practical sharpness. The missile threat does not disappear. It just becomes intermittent instead of continuous. And intermittent pressure is far easier to manage than uninterrupted targeting. That distinction may decide more than a naval exchange. It may decide whether reinforcements arrive on schedule, whether sea lanes remain usable, whether island positions can be sustained, and whether the opening weeks of a war favor rapid fait accompli or prolonged resistance. The fight for the Pacific is not only about who has more missiles, ships, or aircraft. It is about who can keep seeing while the other side starts losing the picture. So when someone asks how a U.S. carrier could be destroyed in the Western Pacific, the disciplined answer is not to point only at the missile battery or the submarine pen. Those matter, but they are downstream. The deeper answer begins in orbit, in the electromagnetic spectrum, in the relay nodes, in the data links, and in the mathematics of a moving target on a very large ocean. A carrier can absorb punishment, evade, defend itself, and strike back with enormous violence. But none of that changes the basic logic. Before a ship can be hit, it has to be found. Before it can be found reliably, it has to be kept visible. And in a modern Pacific war, visibility is not a given, it is a contested resource. That is the quiet truth behind the spectacle. The opening battle for a carrier may look naval on the map, but structurally, it starts as a war over perception. Not in the ocean, in the systems above it,